Welcome everyone to the British Society of Criminology Hate Crime Network podcast. I'm your host, Dr Rachel Keighley, and I use she, they pronouns. Today's guest is John Blyth, who uses he, him pronouns, whose social enterprise and social justice work involves making an impact through collaboration, photography, anti-racist storytelling and creative learning, to name but a few methods. So John, I'm really excited to have you here today on the podcast to talk about all your work. And, you know, as I've just mentioned, you have been involved in a real wide range of projects that focus on social justice as well as creative engagement. So what drives your work in these areas?
Well, thank you, Rachel, for being able to spend some time and being interested to listen into the experiences of the last few decades now. I know that when I was younger, that social documentary photography felt like a powerful tool to be able to share stories, usually of inequity. And it was always from that I know all my interests have grown. But as the years have gone by, as you become more informed, more curious, your experiences shift their gears. I know that inequity still drives it. And I know that different tools are still what I need to try to find to unlock conversations between people. Because I know that when people start to share their experiences together, that all sorts of possibilities become part of their lives, and that sort of powerful force that is relationships, most of all. Relationships and sharing our stories together and having new experiences and developing the self-belief and conviction that that's possible. I think that's the driving force, sort of underpinning everything. And of late, more so as my family has changed too. You see very clearly in my daughters who are dual heritage, the sorts of different challenges that in all our differences in our family that we come together and have to try to understand how to unpick, address, change, build resilience, build communities. And then see what can we get done to try to address that in rural Devon most of all. So there is that driving sense of community building underneath all of this too. It just depends on the tool. I think that's what I found over the years more so, is sometimes that photography is not as powerful and as, I guess, potent as I once thought it could be. Although I'm always aware that it is, but it changes, and therefore sometimes it's looking at, gosh, I guess that's the point of the years, isn't it? Over the years, you get the opportunity to be able to sort of look at the broad array of different pieces that you've picked up to try to see which one's most effective. I guess I always have that sort of sense of, oh gosh, I wish photography was greatly present in what we could do, or audio work or exhibiting, but that's also feeling historical. But I also have to realize sometimes that there's a cohesiveness that often sees a return to the sorts of methods that you've used in the past, but more so of late, definitely community building. That's been really essential, but making connections between people in Devon, between families especially, and sort of bringing points where people can bring the complexities of their experience together and share them. I think that's, yes, I hope that's a sort of meander. That sort of connecting people, that's a very powerful force. I've seen in so many contexts. I think I'm always aware that the work I did I tried to explore when I was younger, it feels quite naive. So I feel like it's limited with regards to the communities I worked into. And also my own life experience as a white man felt rather limited as well, and sort of ignorant, particularly with regards to the inequities. So when I look back to a particular pocket, I just see levels of naivety and ignorance sort of underpinning the limitations of the work. And I think probably what we explore, or what I explore now, feels much more, it's a part of my life, the emotional components of racism and the necessity for anti-racism to be actually the foremost tool in the box, however that's unpacked, however that's sometimes disguised, depending in what context you're trying to create proactive change. It's that's really become very clear as the necessary forefront. Sometimes it doesn't work very well, depending on in which community I go into. Sometimes anti-racism seems like a very frightening and difficult to grasp and reason why to grasp as well, subject to open a conversation in certain spaces. So sometimes it has to be disguised under diversity and inclusion and equity and social justice, but there's no more sort of clear way of describing the activity that feels most essential in all of that sort of community building, all of that sort of social engagement, all of that sense of trying to create a place that's better, a shape that feels like it might improve my daughter's sense of belonging and inclusion in a very white county and region, and also in the sense of nation building as well, and their part in that role in the history of the families here, their non-white families especially. But it's interesting. Addressing anti-racism is very interesting because all it speaks about is proactivity and a great desire to make the cogs of society change through all those different facets. But it's so confrontational. It's just very interesting what you've asked me, because it makes me reflect on all the moments where, yeah, my language is not always put into the right place. I guess that's the learning, isn't it? The learning is sometimes, how to disguise that sense of, and I have good friends who have really reasoned and rationalized and coming at different positions from different lived experiences, but we often come back round to work. We work for equity. It's quite inoffensive for some people who are offended, unfortunately, because they're excluded somehow from a conversation around anti-racism, and find it very hard to grasp the sort of mechanisms and the objectives, which are really quite simple, which do bring you back around to a sense of equity in the work you try to do.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, John. I really appreciated your personal and professional reflection there in terms of the work and the journey you've been on, and how anti-racism underpins and is central to everything that you do. I know it also resonated with me the ways you're talking about having to perhaps badge that slightly differently in order to take different communities on the journey with you, so that you don't, I guess, face that resistance. And you spoke a little bit there about community engagement, and it seems that a lot of the work you do involves engaging with different communities. So how has your understanding of, I guess, the importance of community engagement in your work developed over the years?
All of the work involves people. I've become very clear that although I think I'm quite a hermit, really, and quite a quiet kind of person, actually all of the sort of professional and interesting work that I like to explore is with people. It has to be. And because I work with so many people, I think because as well with the children, it's so essential for them, in my sense, for them to feel, and I might be wrong as a parent, we can only try and work it out our best way that we can, but there's a sense that where we are, that what we need to do has to be very intentional. Because simply the community to address our family's different needs doesn't exist. So we have to really intentionally create that. So when I try and think about my children's sense of growing here, there needs to be a very strong Black community around them to be able to receive a certain facet of who they are. So making that community around Plymouth and around Jabulani, and through Diversity Business Incubator and some of the initiatives such as Culture Club and the Black History Bus. And you're trying to do things in your best judgment as a parent, which often can seem ill-guided almost, but it is done through conversation with them as well. And although very small, some of the questions that they ask are very critically alert. My older daughter, although she'll say, "No, I didn't ask you that, Dad." But I remember very clearly her asking in Plymouth, "Where are all the Jamaicans?" Because our community around Jabulani, which is an African food court that, one of the directors of, are, prevalently Black Africans who've come here for asylum or migration or through refugee status. And it was really good of Mola to spot that sort of sense of who she was and say very clearly, "We're all the Jamaicans." And that's what really guided the narrative for, the Black History Bus emerging, really, is to look into those sort of photographic archival histories, look into those spaces where stories need to have a restorative practice involved, and also looking into institutions, particularly museum spaces, which, you know, they are the fulcrum of the colonial project, and looking into those spaces and trying to uncover, with stakeholders giving guidance from, you know, Black communities, prevalently, global majority, but mostly Black communities in Plymouth, giving guidance about shaping that narrative. But it's responding to the children. And it's the same when we sort of think about, well, okay, good. So we kind of covered a sense of being in Plymouth. Right, that's good. That covers part of who we are. And then we look a little further and think, how do we cover Devon? Because we need to, you know, these are girls who are growing up as global world girls who are needing to be connected to Torquay. They're needing to be connected to Accra, or, you know, Ethiopia, or Kingston, or London, or Totnes, or anywhere. Okay, but we need to be in Devon. That's where we are. So we need to build a community. And that's kind of how mixed families grows. You know, you have an experience, because as people are the driving force to try to find those shared starting points with one another. And for the mixed families together as an initiative, it really grows from being in playgrounds. There's a great desire in where we live anyway, because it has to be very deliberate. You will see another mixed family, and you can almost feel each other magnetizing. It's like, I desperately want us to connect and build friendships. And so, you know, mixed families have been such a joy over the last year and a half. And, you know, we've been able to sort of begin to cultivate a community across Devon, realistically, by having these events and meetups in different places around the county. So we have to, you know, cover that as well, because, you know, the realism is that my older daughter's the only brown child in her class. So I know that speaking to her elders, you know, her teenage versions who are a little bit older, and sort of listening to their experiences, it's like, okay, good. We need to put these communities together, because the communities we exist in just don't cater for all of our needs very well. And it's peculiar, actually, as a white man, I'm surrounded by versions, invariable versions of myself, you know, sort of bearded 50-year-old balding white men. And yet at the same time, it's interesting as we grow as people, because I find it, you know, very difficult, if I'm honest. I find it very difficult to connect to a lot of people, because our experiences have stretched us far. I feel like we've played around the edges of English identity, and I feel like that's where we're living in, and everything is quite experimental as we try to really, you know, people use that word belonging, but actually like really building and cultivating belonging, and the sense of identity profoundly has changed me into living in that state of discomfort. But I also know that's where we're at, you know. It's a frontiersland, land, really. Rural England for diverse families is a kind of pioneering type of space. And it's great. It's really great. At least I know I'm, you know, sort of alive in the middle of a lot of turmoil. But you see these sorts of shifts, you see these changes, you see processes of watching institutions challenged. You watch them mostly as they're quite led as white leadership spaces. They look to sort of grow, but they have to confront some realities that are designed into their systems. You try to create methods that can begin to sort of unpick extent in a sort of responsible way, but also frame the realism of the impact that the lack of change will have. So we try and, I guess, create at times alternative systems and structures, ones which encourage enterprise, community, the exchange of finance and economy to support entrepreneurship. And all of these things, I hope, are modelling ways that support particularly, you know, our sort of young Black girls and young Black boys here to feel like this is a place where I can get done what I want to get done. I don't have to go to Bristol. I don't have to go to London. And that's what I hope for. But you still get, as a parent, every now and then, your daughter will say, Dad, what are we doing this weekend? I say, this weekend we're going to go to Jablani. We're going to go and have some, you know, Ethiopian food, you know. It's like where Nana lives in Ethiopia. But and on Sunday we're going to do mixed families together up in Exeter. And perhaps your older daughter will say, can we just have a weekend where we don't talk about diversity? And you think, okay, I'll take that on board. But yes, it's only 3 people. It has to be. This is the problem in the country for a lot of, I mean, it's my opinion. It's not substantiated by any facts, but, you know, I did watch the riots unfold in the city where we lived and under our window. And, you know, I know the reality is that there's a lot of white communities aren't having conversations. They're not having shared experiences with new communities, new English communities. And because of that disconnect, it's very easy for certain motivations to sow discontent and discord year after year, which drives people apart. But, you know, I'm very clear that what we can do is create inclusive stories where people are involved in nation building together. And it does really quickly bridge some of those spaces, particularly somewhere like Jabalani, you know, where, you know, part of the big exchange there is cultural exchange and knowledge through food. So, you know, it's anti-racism ultimately, but it's done in a way that brings people to a direct conversation, a process of sharing and process of having new experiences. And I see the change, really see the changes taking place there. But again, it's intentional. It has to be.
Yeah, it was really helpful to hear about the various projects that you've been involved in and the motivations that they've stemmed from, I guess, to carve out a place of identity, ownership and belonging within rural spaces. And, you know, you speak about rural spaces. A project that I'm on is looking at racism in rural spaces and that sense of connection and belonging, and exploring, as you also talked about, identity and what it means to be anything, and the pushback that we get from the white English population over who owns a space, what it means to be English, what it means to be British, and the exclusions that are sort of inherent within that we are, as white people, taught, whether very overtly or even subconsciously through our curriculums and through our interactions with other white people. So I think the spaces that you're carving are really, really important to challenge that. And I love the work that you do, particularly when you mentioned Jabalani, in terms of offering a shared space to learn about each other through, you know, a mutual connection with food. You know, I think that's something that's really powerful. It's not sitting there preaching to people. It's having a much more nuanced, interactive, safe space to explore these things. And, you know, you mentioned working with, I guess, marginalized and minoritized communities and with the local white populations to try and bridge those gaps. And have you had any barriers to meaningful inclusion and meaningful learning within the work that you've been doing?
It's really a good question. What you make me think of is some of the moments where it's really obviously successful, like visually, you just have to look. I'll just pick up on one of those. I just want to write down an experience though from the school. So during Black History Month, Diversity Business Incubator in Plymouth is kind of like a point with Jabalani. So Jabalani really has sort of grown from that. But Jabalani is really, you know, its main focus is on supporting Black and, well, in the context anyway, minoritized women by their ethnicity to develop agency, most of all, economic agency through food enterprises. So it's quite powerful because of that sort of contextualization of it in Plymouth particularly. Every place has its very particular set of circumstances by its context. So in its space, it's really revolutionary. You know, you've got Black-led economic spaces, Black females leading the direction forwards. And in terms of peer learning and peer exchange and building confidence, somewhere like Jabalani, you know, we've just sent off our Awards for All funding for funding a platform called Girls to Women, which is really about scaffolding that space for a very little sort of, you know, global majority girls to really learn from their elders at all different stages. So that, again, space of, I guess, resilience and female Black power empowerment is really economically secured as well. I think that's really important because no one's dodging, no one's electing themselves out of the capitalist space at all. We want to, you know, have people participate in that, be valued inside that system. So social enterprise is really important. But inside that space during Black History Month, some of the more powerful sort of platforms I see is the food and heritage events, and it's really open. It's an invite for people to come in and learn about a particular narrative, which might be Caribbean narrative, it might be a West African narrative, but it's learning about those new British communities, really relatively new for some people who come in anyway. And that's done through an exchange of food. We've had patty making, kind of like Jamaican patty making workshops, where Rudolph would, give a really great insight into his own sort of personal histories. And, for some people who would attend, really understanding rather than through the media, which is the real sort of vehicle to overcome, is so how first-hand experiences of listening to one another take place rather than them being mediated through, a fantastic space such as football or any number of other sorts of places people can understand a certain story. But it's those direct connections, and food and heritage just brings people together from all different parts of the local community. In an area called Stonehouse, you see people come by from the various sort of social housing which is on the neighbourhood. They come in, they learn, they pound yam. Some people will come from maybe an academic space and or from the museum, and you'll get these wonderful moments where you've just got this like photograph, and this is where photography becomes a powerful tool in terms of demonstrating how these sorts of events bring a lot of people together, because then all of a sudden you'll have that space, you'll have people, you'll listen, you'll hear Polish being spoken, you'll hear a language I'm not familiar with, which is from somewhere in Southeast Asia. You'll hear different dialects in terms of accents coming from a range of different people. You'll hear the local Plymouthians with their Jana accent who've just dropped in from next door. And then you photograph it and you see them and you see England. It's like, here's England. That's what my England looks like. And that's the kind of England we need to get everybody to a point of feeling like it's everyday life. It's not something that's consumed online that happens over in some other city or happens across the road in a way that I don't know quite how to bridge that space. And you do it through food. And then the next week, I remember a lovely conversation with the white people from next door who are, as Plymouth as they come. They're really great people. We're in Jabulani, which has its range of paintings of sort of prominent black people who have been in the city making waves historically, but always had a narrative suppressed, like football Jack Leslie or rugby player Jimmy Phillips. But they'll come in, they'll sit there, they'll buy their coffee, they'll go over and buy their plantain and sit down, and they're waiting for some Eritrean food to come over, and you'll sit and they say, what should we do? Oh, we should add a dartboard in here. And you're like, yeah, we should add a dartboard. And I know it's like the pieces of the fusions are taking place. And food and heritage has been fantastic for doing that. So I feel, there's ways of talking about anti-racism. And I think sometimes I've learned the hard way by maybe sort of raising it and feeling the sort of, what's the word, it's almost like a blunt thump, where it's not been responded to because I haven't understood well enough to judge the context that I'm working into. And that's not responded well. But then, you learn through doing, and then you'd see, other vehicles like Food and Heritage or through Ubuntu, which we run through Torbay, run out of Torbay, which is another very different area. You see something like Farewell Jamaica, which is, Nev performing a story of migration during the Windrush period, and you see that performed in a library up on Dartmoor in Morton Hampstead. You're like, yeah, that's the way to do it. So there are moments where it's like a gentle way, which I think I've learned most of all over like several years now. Safe spaces for critical conversations about race can be very helpful, as well as knowing when to sort of turn the dial up, especially in spaces where systems and structures really perpetuate racism and a level of ignorance that's quite culturally in need of radical address. But yes, there are subtle ways of doing these things. I think on my mind you were sort of asking me a little bit about some of those experiences, and I was thinking about the confrontations though as well, and I was thinking about we managed to sort of set up a pretty effective parents diversity group in my children's school. And it felt like a safe space for critical conversations about race and addressing the curricula to make it more able to be anti-racist and not to be, anything other than anti-racist. I'm not talking about diversity, inclusion. I'm not talking about that. But it was really interesting to be in a meeting where, a white parent came along and was really, unable to be anything other than confrontational about the necessity. And it's quite shocking when you feel like you've created safe spaces, because on the street, in some regards, your family is a pretty game target at times for a range of different comments, looks, whatever it may come, you may get at different points depending on who you are. But then when you create the safe spaces and it arises, it's quite interesting to sort of see, because you've really exposed yourself in the safe space. You've left yourself very vulnerable and very sort of open. So it's quite shocking to sort of have, a context which you think is, reflective of your value systems, really open to not interrogation, confrontation. Yeah, I think confrontation is part of the experience. It's, I'm lucky. I'm a white man. I don't have to face that kind of level that I've seen other family members address. I often get to observe it as if I'm someone who's not quite connected somehow. It's quite interesting being the white man in the mixed race family, because sometimes you're not seen as part of the family because you're not brown, and you are sort of, you become party to conversations which otherwise you wouldn't hear because they're quite discreet, such as in a swimming pool. I remember being in a swimming pool in Plymouth, and my children were out playing, and I was just sitting in the little jacuzzi that's always cold, just watching, thinking, this is a great pool today. Look at all the mixed race families this is amazing. There's so many brown children in the pool. This is brilliant. I love this pool. But then a couple got into me, into the little pool with me, and just sort of, being exposed to their prejudices or their ignorances were quite interesting to listen to, and interesting to then address with them when I get out of the jacuzzi as well. And, having mixed race children is not fashionable at all. As these are the sorts of interesting light parts of their conversation, but you have to address this. You have to. I feel like I often live in a place where like confrontation's just about to come up. There's not, you can't not address this. And you hear in parks and places, I do as a white man, I hear these things, and you cannot let that slide at all. So it's just hard when it arises, when you get a telephone call from your school, or you're somewhere just slightly separate from your children. So yes, it's interesting. Yeah, agitation, confrontation. I didn't always. It's interesting. I am. I can always say you are, but it's interesting how exposed I've become to discrimination and prejudice. And if only every white person could have that sort of torn off, their naivety torn off them, that safe vacuum that I think most white people do exist in. If that could be tore away, then you'd soon see people want to be more empathetical and compassionate. I don't believe that the barriers would be built up more resistantly. It would just become very raw and real, like the reality is for most global majority people in England every day. In some way, shape or form, that's the lived experience. And I don't have that depth, but I do have some of that observationally, and I do feel something of that, but nothing of that kind of level. But it's a horrible it's always there. There's always a frequency of racism in England. It's always, and it's there. And there are moments where it just reveals itself, like the riots, and you're like, yeah. And people reveal their shocks. Oh gosh, we can't believe it. But it's coming. It's always coming. Just waiting to see how it comes. Whether it's a phone call from your school, that discrimination's always there.
Yeah. Thank you so much for, sharing both the work that's come from that and some of those personal experiences of, I guess, being on the coalface as someone who straddles that insider outsider binary, to use the terminology we use in academic spaces of, belonging or really being situated within communities that experience discrimination versus a level of privilege, so therefore cannot directly experience it, but can observe it, can empathize with it, especially like you said, as you've got children who are exposed to discrimination and racism. And it's really interesting to hear a lot of the work that you've been involved in and being a part of that exists outside of traditional academic spaces, because obviously a lot of what we do, and myself and my colleagues do within the Hate Crime Network, is academic research on exactly what you're talking about: racism, other forms of hate crime and discrimination. And part of the Hate Crime Network's work is to bridge that gap between academic research and making sure we're making a change, being real activists within communities on the ground. And there's a challenge within doing that, certainly. And I wondered if you'd ever come across any of those challenges in connecting academic research, whether there even is a place for academic research. I'm more than happy for you to push back on that, and with the grassroots activism and projects that are going on.
It's a great question, Rachel, because I think when we think, firstly, that we need to consider context, because context leads to different methods, different approaches, different knowledges, different lived experiences, different communities of thought. So I can only really talk about those contexts that I've worked in academically around mostly the Southwest, mostly Devon and Cornwall. So one of those great hurdles is those structures and those cultures and those ignorances that exist within white leadership. That's a reality. So when you counter that privilege, it's like you have to try to rewire the way that all the behaviours have led people to a place of not being very critical or not doing the work, and not doing the work that's really necessary to try to understand, first of all, what those inequities really might actually be like every day for people. And there's a great unwillingness to actually do the hard graft, to get stuck in and to understand what's really needed. I think I haven't worked anywhere where that level of emotional and intellectual capacity has synthesized in a way where really sincere interrogation of the structures, and in academic spaces, in institutes, higher education, everything is about making structures. All the learning is designed. None of it, you don't just trip over it and it happens, it falls out of your pocket and here's a package of learning and research. It's not, it's very conscious. So when you counter a consciousness that hasn't worked to inform itself critically about race, ethnicity, national identities, and they then want to do work which is easy to term under equality, diversity, and inclusion. Inclusion is really on whose terms? Our terms. But we haven't looked, we haven't worked, we haven't made those intrusions in a way at first, intrusions into a place where we feel uncomfortable. And there is a cultural issue when you counter that white leadership in, I think, the academic spaces that I've worked, is there just isn't that, not always capacity, there's not the willingness to actually expose yourself to the cruelties of race and discrimination and prejudice. It's a second-hand story. It's not a primary first-hand experience. And therefore, without those experiences, there's either an incredulity when you try to expose what that reality is really like, that you actually really want to bring into the learning in some way by making connections with good community groups, good community organisations, good grassroots social enterprises, initiatives that are led by people of colour into your home. Effectively, you're opening something that's really actually got to totally address and change and reorientate and rewire the whole of the way you're doing your business. And I have tried hard to, I think, go up against those spaces by, working on efforts like an allyship guide for staff, academic staff. And it feels so like a lukewarm bath. You're not really getting into the hot water here at all, and you're not actually willing to. And so it's really difficult to sort of make those long-term connections, between sincere connections, most of all, understand the time and pace that, grassroots organizations, they don't change on a whim. They're deeply value-driven, value-based, and they are communities trying to serve one another, to improve one another's agency in different ways. So it's really hard for academic spaces, I think anyway, higher education, learning and businesses, higher education businesses, to actually talk successfully, and to do anything that's nothing other than often short-term, momentary, that serves perhaps a particular funding for knowledge exchange or a particular moment in someone's career. But I can only talk about the spaces where the leadership is 95% white. I don't know all of their family details, and if they have narratives that really expose them to be critically alert to their privilege, then they don't reveal them at all beyond their professional facade. And so, to foster a long-term, to use the potential that's really there. The potential is massive because there's a lot of people. And when you've got a lot of people, there's the capacity to perhaps create a lot of change. But it's never deployed in a way that's mutually beneficial. It's usually one I find that's quite extractive. And that's not much good, because most grassroots, small initiatives, social enterprises, they need capital. They need finance. They're trying to pioneer, they're trying to innovate, they're bringing something that's radically new to its context. It's actually cutting edge research, and it needs money. That's all it really needs. It doesn't need people very much at all. It needs cash poured in to sort of make things feel sustainable and the capacity to be sustained in a way. And therefore, to try to design something with a higher education institute where I've been working and lived is really complicated, because it feels like the parts can't talk easily, because there's an unwillingness to ultimately look at the hard reality of the inequities that are between those two spaces. There's not the capacity for the critical reflection to be undertaken with a level of sincerity that would drive the profound change that's needed in those sorts of institutions. And also that's then very highly reflective in why your student numbers stay massively white, why you don't have staff who are of colour at all desiring to work or stay in employment at your institute, because ultimately the bones underneath need really restructuring, and that's a big job. That's my opinion, and that's my experience. I think also as a white man, and I'm not sort of naive to my own ignorances in my life and the last decade or more of trying to rewire my own thoughts and my own sort of cultural understanding of my own privilege, which has been extensive. And I think into my relationship with my daughter's mother in those moments of naivety, and also actually just pure ignorance, laziness. And then I sort of amplify my own sense of belief systems and structures to a certain point onto large scale organizations responsible for learning about, modern England, and the hard work that really does take, actually, to really expose yourself to your own stupidity. and your own then desire to try to work hard to evolve something which feels more fit for where we're at and where we're going. And you try and look at an organisation that's steeped in histories that have tried to deny certain narratives or power structures being changed, and you know that this is hard. This is hard work. I don't see good leadership enough. I think probably that's my answer best. If I saw good leadership, then I'd see people who revealed their vulnerabilities. And that doesn't happen very often in the kind of capital-driven place of higher education currently.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that reflection. I think it's really important to challenge the place of academia and the institutions, as you say, and the hierarchies that are inherent and white-centric and patriarchal and ableist and heteronormative, and that we see and exist within. And you said you've worked in academic spaces. I currently work in academic spaces. Many people in the hate crime network also work in academic spaces, and it is fighting those tensions within ourselves and our own learnings that we're having to do, but the tensions that exist within the structures that we have placed ourselves in, and trying to challenge those whilst also trying to push beyond the boundaries of academia and make sure that the work we're doing does have that impact. So it's not, as you said, extractive or performative or a tick box approach for the university to say, look at us and the research we're doing. And I wondered if you had, from those reflections, any thoughts on what could be some opportunities for either community-led research, because I think it has to be community and grassroots driven, but what the place of academia and academic research might be within that.
I think I know that what we do in Jabberlining is very innovative, and I know that it makes a real sincere and meaningful social impact. I know it makes an economic impact too. And when we really look at what we need is, at times, if good academics really had the capacity, which is what research can do in those relationships, is to make that evidenced, to make that clear and stark statistically. Because when we look at this challenge to create a social enterprise and sustain, relatively small African food court in the context of a prevalently white city, it's really hard. And sometimes what we just don't have is that ability to look at a particular piece of funding which is about innovation, that will allow us to demonstrate our social impact, allow us to enter into a sustained long-term partnership, at least known for many, many years, and to bring in what good academics really should do, for me, is to present something evidential. We don't have that kind of ability at all. And that would make a difference if that could lead to a point where that income could be changed. Because I think we really know that we do something that's quite radical in its context, and it's quite evolutionary in terms of culture and society. But we cannot always demonstrate that, because we have to ensure that we continue to generate the income we can from the food that we sell, or the coffee that we sell, or from the events that we hold and host. And that's really hard. So it's that sort of, it's being willing to be led as well. And maybe this is sometimes the challenge, perhaps, to academia as well, is to be not in control. I think academia is often seeking that. That's also part of that patriarchal structure too, is that want to control. Even if they don't express overtly, I need to control. But everything in the culture is always about controlling. If I think about all those schemes of work that I've designed, at the end of the day, it's my framework. It's my prison that I'm holding you in. However much breadth I give you, or flexibility and versatility to explore, it's still held in my design. It has to go the other way. And co-designing is really important. Social enterprises are always co-designing, and they're always collaborating, and they're always participating, but they live that language every day. That's just what they do, because they have to, because it's really hard to keep something moving. I know that HE's eyes have their own struggles. That's really clear in the sector. It's as stark as it's ever been. However, all those methods which are really talked about social impact and meaningful engagement and collaboration, it just has to be lived in, but it doesn't always have a time frame. It's something that, why relationships are so central to what I try to do is that sustaining relationships over long periods of time allows you to grow a culture together, something that's an authentic culture to yourselves and to your needs, and a place in which hopefully everyone is eventually heard, or providing an opportunity to speak loudly, or supported to be able to give guidance or lead. That's how I like the hope that some of these sorts of initiatives, which I do think are, genuinely, they're really innovating and quite pioneering in their context of like Devon, rural England. But they show methods of behaviour, methods of how communities co-design and shape what is important to them. And I see that in Jabulani, I see that in mixed families, I see that in Ubuntu. I even see it, partially from time to time in the school. That's very different. But higher education and academia needs to be more willing, I think, to ultimately live inside that method and to concede control. And if that can happen, and you can really embrace collaboration, many changes could be possible. But only if we just shift that really patriarchal white prism of control. It's not, I don't have statistics to present you, but when we live in these cultures, we see what they look like. They are quite clear, and I've tried very hard, and that's probably why I've always had one footstep outside of those places. Is that I don't trust them. I don't fully believe in what the value systems are being lived. The words are there, and I read them, but I don't see the actions follow fully. So it's a little, it's contradictory, because I really love those spaces, but mostly because they offer so much promise, and they offer so much potential to really enact meaningful change in this country. And at the moment, they're in a bridle to a certain sort of financial system, and that's really restraining, I think, probably a lot of good people. It's restricting their capacity and their potential to really do the good, which a lot of universities seek through their research to achieve.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that, John. And just to finish, I think I want to speak now to individuals. So if you could challenge people listening to take action on maybe one thing, wherever they are in their anti-racism journey, what would it be?
Become more vulnerable. Speak to more people who are not like who you are. Don't just consume stories by picking up a book. Don't just listen to a podcast or something that you think will suddenly give you real insight. It will give you insight of a kind. It'll start you on a journey, and that's really crucial. To be vulnerable, to be knowing that you're not right because you're not very well informed, being okay about not being informed, being okay about, really questioning how racist you've been in your life is an important part of trying to understand. But building relationships, making connections, wanting to know about people's lives, wanting to share in people's lives, wanting to find out why has it been so different, and to want to go on some new journey together, and to put in the time to sort of become trusted. Becoming trusted is very important, and you won't be trusted unless you're very involved, and sincere, and turning up, and not just turning up, but then not speaking over, then just listening, just trying to work out, why has it been so different for you? How did I have this experience and you have that experience? But then to start to take and really understand that what you're doing is you're nurturing empathy, and compassion's not compassionate behaviors is not something that's alien. It's something that's familiar. It's just about caring. It's really simple stuff, actually, but you need to go and be vulnerable because you've been told something for a long time, particularly as a white person. And I think that's where really the location of the change has to come from. It has to be a journey for white people prevalently to do the work, so that the doing the work's not an alien phrase that feels slightly uncomfortable for you, but just understand that it's just being part of England and getting to know all the different people who are here, who are English, or stretching your sense of what Englishness can be. I like to believe that it'll hold everyone. It should be able to. God, it really tried for hundreds and hundreds of years to really hold everyone. So in amongst that naivety, there's a reality. You know, that's people's life every day, but you need to go and make sure that it's not something that's just consumed on a TV, listened to on a radio. And I think that's really the struggle in the rural parts of the UK. Those confrontations have to be made because our families have changed so significantly. And it doesn't take long for people to be, and this great thing about England ultimately is that it's got limitations because it's got a shoreline. The island has got edges, which means you can't confront, not confront rather, you can't deny that you've got to confront this experience of differences and the true sort of potential of a multi-ethnic England and what that really feels like for those particularly white people in rural England. They need to get to that space so that they feel like they're part of the national conversation. When they turn on and they listen and they watch the English football team and they watch Jude Bellingham and they watch Saka and they watch all these like multinational, ethnic children in this country and say, okay, that's my experience as well. That happens in my school. That does actually happen in my village. I need to go and make the effort and not sort of exist detached, thinking that happens in London or that happens in Manchester or this happens in Bristol. No, it doesn't actually at all. It happens, you know, in little villages and towns. It happens in South Molton in Devon or on the edge of Exeter in Cranbrook or in Dartington in the South Hams or anywhere else, in Stonehouse in Plymouth and everywhere. But it's conversation and it's relationships. And I really think it's, you know, most of often what we think comes from our own journeys. Then 10 years later, we realise how ignorant we were 10 years earlier. But at this moment, it is about making relationships and just being involved and coming to a point of empathy and compassion. Be self-critical about yourself and expose your vulnerability and realise that you really are not right very often at all so far. Some of those things, I think, Rachel.
Yeah, no, honestly, thank you so much for that, John. I think that was a really important message to end on, and hopefully people listening will absorb and reflect on that and challenge their own standpoints and position here. But I really wanted to thank you for your time, reflections and expertise today. It's been a really important conversation I think we needed to have, so thank you for coming along.
Yeah, thanks for, like, honestly, I know I ramble, you know, open up to a sort of stream of thinking, but you've created the space for that, and I'm really grateful that it's of interest to you, and hopefully anyone who listens, you know, they'll find a point in terms of locating their own conversations as well, because we've just got to talk to each other and then we get the chance to learn from one another better, I feel. So thank you. Thanks for making that space.
Thank you.